What if the person you built your life around wasn't the person you thought you knew? Not because they lied loudly, not because they were careless, but because they never told you everything. And by the time you realized what was missing, the truth had already reshaped your entire future. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At 41, Prince Harry is no longer the angry young royal the tabloids froze in time. He's no longer the defiant husband standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife against the world. And he's no longer the man trying to prove anything to anyone. What he is now is reflective, quieter, measured in a way that unsettles people who preferred him impulsive and predictable. And according to those who followed him closely, that shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, in private, in moments that didn't make headlines. Because this story isn't about a sudden confession. It's about something far more uncomfortable. It's about the realization that the foundation of your marriage may have been built on information you never had access to, and questions you didn't know you were supposed to ask. Ask yourself this: have you ever looked back at the beginning of a relationship and realized the warning signs were there, but they didn't look like warnings at the time? They looked like passion, mystery, depth, pain that needed understanding. Harry has spent years telling the world his story about grief, about trauma, about the press, about family betrayal, about exile. But there's one part of the story he avoided, not because it wasn't important, but because it was too close to home, too personal, too destabilizing, and, according to those familiar with his thinking now, that silence wasn't accidental. It was protective. Because once you start asking questions about what you were never told, you have to accept what those answers might mean. This isn't a story about villainy or innocence. It's not about painting anyone as a monster. And it's not about reducing a marriage to gossip. It's about something far more relatable and far more dangerous. The slow realization that love does not automatically equal honesty. From the outside, the love story was perfect. A prince broken by loss meets an accomplished woman who understands pain, purpose, and resilience. Two outsiders find each other. Two wounded people build something new. A modern fairy tale against an outdated institution. That's the version sold to the public. And for a long time, Harry believed it too. He wanted to, he needed to. Because after everything he'd lost, his mother, his sense of safety, his trust in the system he was born into, the idea of finally choosing his own family felt like redemption. Like healing, like control. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one talks about when it comes to whirlwind romances. Speed hides gaps. Intensity compresses time, and emotional urgency can make silence feel like depth. When two people bond quickly over shared trauma, the relationship often feels profound, electric, destined. But trauma bonding has a shadow side. It creates blind spots, and according to those who've observed Harry closely, there were blind spots he didn't see until much later. Blind spots that didn't surface until life forced him to slow down. The public often assumes secrets come out through explosions, affairs, scandals, leaks. But most secrets don't arrive like that. They surface quietly, through inconsistencies, through moments that don't add up, through questions that get redirected instead of answered. And Harry's reckoning, by all accounts, began not with a fight, but with confusion. Small things at first. Stories that changed slightly depending on who was listening. Details that never quite aligned. A past that was discussed emotionally but never concretely. Have you ever noticed how some people talk around certain topics instead of through them? How pain can be shared without clarity. How vulnerability can exist without disclosure. For a long time, Harry interpreted that as sensitivity, as privacy, as trauma he didn't have the right to probe. And in fairness, who wants to interrogate the person they love? Especially when that person has framed their life as survival. Especially when the world already feels hostile. Especially when questioning feels like betrayal. So he didn't press, he trusted. And in doing so, he unknowingly made a decision that would shape everything that came after. Because when you don't ask the hard questions early, they don't disappear. They wait, they grow teeth, and they return when the stakes are higher. Marriage doesn't just unite two people. It merges futures, expectations, assumptions. And one of the most dangerous assumptions in any relationship is the belief that you already know the full story. Harry has spoken often about feeling misled by institutions, by the media, by his family. But what he hasn't addressed, at least not directly, is the possibility that the deepest sense of misalignment didn't come from outside forces. It came from within his own marriage. Not through malice, through omission. And omission is harder to confront than lies, because omission forces you to ask a brutal question. Did they hide this from me, or did I never ask because I was afraid of the answer? As Harry entered his late 30s, something changed. The chaos slowed, the adrenaline faded. The constant battles quieted just enough for reflection to creep in, and reflection is dangerous when you've built your life on momentum, because reflection invites hindsight, and hindsight doesn't care how noble your intentions were. It only cares about patterns, moments that didn't fit, conversations that felt rehearsed, timelines that were vague, revelations that arrived later than they should have. According to those close to Harry now, it was during this quieter phase of his life that the first real crack appeared. Not a scandal, a question. A single, uncomfortable question that refused to stay buried, and once that question existed, everything else began to rearrange itself around it. Memory works like that. You don't rewrite the past, you reinterpret it. Suddenly, moments you dismissed resurface with sharper edges. Statements you accepted without hesitation demand re-examination. And love, once unquestionable, becomes conditional on understanding. This is the part of the story that makes people uneasy, because it suggests something we'd rather not believe, that even in the most public love stories, there are private truths that never make it to the altar, and that sometimes the most damaging secrets aren't explosive, they're foundational. Harry didn't wake up one day and decide to open up. This wasn't a confessional moment fueled by bitterness. It was a slow, painful reckoning fueled by maturity, by age, by the realization that protecting a narrative can come at the cost of protecting yourself. At 41, Harry is old enough to look back honestly, and young enough to still feel the consequences, old enough to see where he filled in gaps with hope, young enough to know those gaps still matter. And here's the part most people miss. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing that love, built on partial truth, is still partial love, and partial love creates full-scale consequences. Children, legacies, public roles, emotional debts. When people say the truth always comes out, they imagine exposure, but sometimes the truth comes out internally, and that's worse, because no one else can validate it. No one else can argue with it. It just sits there, heavy, unavoidable, waiting for you to decide what to do next. Harry hasn't told the world everything. Not yet, but according to those who've watched him change, he has reached a point where silence no longer feels like protection. It feels like self-erasure. And the first thing he had to confront wasn't what the world believed. It was what he believed. And why? Because before the marriage unraveled emotionally, before the public battles escalated, before the exile hardened into identity, there was a moment, a private moment, when Harry realized there was something about the woman he married that he didn't fully understand, and that realization scared him more than the press ever did. But that moment didn't happen after the wedding. It didn't happen after the children, and it didn't happen after the fallout. According to those familiar with his thinking, it happened much earlier, long before the world was watching. And once we go back to that beginning, the story looks very different. But to understand that moment, we have to rewind, back to who Meghan was to Harry at the start, back to the woman he thought he was choosing, back to the version of the story that made perfect sense, until it didn't. Because what came next wasn't a scandal. It was something far more destabilizing, a realization that would quietly alter how Harry viewed his marriage, his choices, and himself. And once that realization took hold, nothing was ever the same. What if the person you fell in love with was real, but incomplete? Not fake, not invented, just carefully framed. Because when Harry looks back now, the question that haunts him isn't whether Meghan was lying. It's whether he ever met the whole person at all. The version of Meghan that entered his life didn't arrive quietly. She arrived fully formed, confident, articulate, purpose-driven. She spoke like someone who had already processed her pain and come out stronger on the other side. That mattered to Harry. After years of being treated like a reckless spare, he didn't want to be managed. He wanted to be understood, and Meghan seemed to understand him instantly. Or at least, she mirrored him in a way that felt like understanding. Think about it. How often do we mistake recognition for intimacy? When someone reflects our wounds back to us in familiar language, we assume they've lived them the same way. We assume alignment, we assume safety. Harry wasn't looking for a fairy tale, he was looking for refuge. And refuge, when it arrives, wrapped in certainty, is intoxicating. From the very beginning, Meghan presented herself as a woman shaped by adversity, not broken by it, not defeated, but sharpened. She spoke about struggle in a way that felt rehearsed yet sincere, painful but polished, as if she had already curated the narrative, not just for the world, but for herself. That impressed him, because Harry was still raw, still improvising, still bleeding through jokes and rebellion. She seemed finished, complete, and when you're unfinished, completeness feels like destiny. The early conversations were intense, long, emotional, filled with shared values and overlapping grievances. They talked about injustice, about the cruelty of the press, about identity, about feeling misrepresented. But notice what they didn't talk about: specifics, timelines, concrete details that require follow-up questions. Instead, the past was presented emotionally, not factually. And emotion is harder to interrogate. If someone says, "That part of my life was painful," you don't ask for footnotes. You empathize. You step back. You respect the boundary. Harry did exactly that, because he didn't want to be another man demanding access to a woman's past, especially a woman who framed herself as having survived, especially when the world already demanded explanations from him. There's a particular kind of bond that forms when two people meet at a crossroads. Harry was at one. The monarchy felt suffocating. His role felt obsolete. His grief felt unresolved. Meghan arrived offering clarity, a sense of forward motion, a promise, subtle but powerful, that together they could transcend the chaos. That framing matters, because when someone positions themselves as the answer to your confusion, you don't question their origin story. You accept it. You want it to be true. And the public persona only reinforced that trust. Meghan was articulate, media savvy, familiar with cameras but not intimidated by them. She knew how to speak in sound bites that felt authentic. To Harry, that wasn't manipulation. It was competence. He'd spent his life around people trained to perform sincerity: royals, aides, spokespeople. Meghan felt different. She spoke the language of activism, not protocol. She framed her life as a journey, not a resume. And journeys don't require full disclosure up front. Or so he thought. Have you ever noticed how people who control their narrative often appear the most vulnerable? Because vulnerability, when curated, becomes a shield. It disarms suspicion. It invites trust without inviting scrutiny. In those early months, Harry wasn't asking, "What don't I know?" He was asking, "How soon can I protect this?" Protect it from the press, from his family, from skepticism. And protection creates loyalty before verification. The faster the relationship escalated, the more the outside world faded. The less room there was for pause. They didn't date in a normal sense. They didn't drift slowly into love. They collided. And collision leaves debris. Friends noticed it. Some admired it. Others felt uneasy. But unease is easy to dismiss when you're convinced you finally found your person. Harry framed the intensity as fate, as proof, as inevitability. And when people raised concerns about pace, about compatibility, about differences, he interpreted it as resistance, not caution. That distinction is important, because when you frame skepticism as hostility, you stop listening, you stop noticing nuance, you stop asking questions that might disrupt the story you're already telling yourself. The woman Harry fell for wasn't just Meghan the individual, it was Meghan the idea. The idea that he could step outside the institution and still matter, that he could choose love over legacy and not lose himself, that he could rewrite his story without losing his identity. And Meghan fit that idea perfectly. But here's the uncomfortable thing about ideas. They don't require full information. They require belief. The public saw a confident woman stepping into an ancient system. Harry saw a partner who understood oppression, media cruelty, and emotional survival. But what he didn't see, not yet, was how much of her identity depended on controlling perception. And that's not a flaw on its own. We all do it to some degree. The difference is scale and consequence. As their relationship moved from private to public, the narrative solidified quickly. Too quickly. Engagement. Marriage. Global scrutiny. There was no time to recalibrate, no time to revisit early assumptions, no time to sit with discomfort. And discomfort did exist. Small moments Harry brushed aside, a question answered vaguely, a story that changed tone depending on context, an emotional response that didn't quite align with the topic. But when love is loud, doubt whispers. And whispers are easy to ignore, especially when ignoring them feels like loyalty. Harry wanted to be loyal, not just to Meghan, but to the version of himself she represented. The man who chose, the man who escaped, the man who wasn't trapped by duty. So he doubled down. He defended harder, he questioned less, and the more the world pushed back, the more he closed ranks around the relationship. Because when the outside pressure increases, internal flaws feel irrelevant. Or so it seems. This is where hindsight becomes cruel. Because looking back, Harry now sees the beginning not as destiny, but as momentum. A momentum that didn't allow for full disclosure. A momentum that rewarded alignment over truth. And a momentum that made it easier to say, I trust you, than to ask, is there more I should know? Ask yourself this. If someone tells you they've been through pain, do you need to know every detail to love them? Probably not. But if that pain shapes decisions, expectations, and future plans, shouldn't you at least understand its contours? Harry thought empathy was enough. He thought respect meant not probing. He thought love meant acceptance without interrogation. And in many ways, those instincts were honorable. But they also created a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty. They fill with assumptions, with hope, with projections. And according to those who've watched Harry reflect now, the first real discomfort didn't come from a revelation, it came from a realization. That he knew how Meghan felt, but not always why. That he understood her reactions, but not always their roots. That certain topics were framed emotionally, but never explored practically. And marriage, unlike dating, demands practicality. It demands shared reality. That realization didn't hit him like a thunderbolt. It crept in. During planning conversations, future-oriented discussions, moments where specifics suddenly mattered, moments where vague answers stopped being sufficient. Harry began to notice how quickly certain discussions were redirected, how emotional language replaced clarity, how discomfort was reframed as misunderstanding, and how his desire not to push was rewarded with reassurance, not answers. Reassurance feels good, answers feel risky. Which would you choose if you were already under siege? Exactly. Harry chose reassurance, again and again, because reassurance kept the story intact. But reassurance has an expiration date. It works until life demands precision, and life always does. As the wedding approached, the pressure intensified. Public expectations skyrocketed, every detail scrutinized, every choice politicized. And inside that chaos, Harry convinced himself there would be time later. Time to talk, time to unpack, time to understand each other fully once the noise died down. But life doesn't pause for clarity. It accelerates. And the faster it moves, the harder it becomes to admit you might have skipped steps. The woman the world met was poised, purposeful, and persuasive. The woman Harry married was complex, driven, and deeply invested in narrative. But the woman Harry is now trying to understand may be someone he never fully met at the start. And that's the part no one wants to talk about, because it suggests something deeply unsettling, that you can love someone sincerely and still not know them completely, that you can build a marriage on shared pain and miss the parts that matter most, that you can choose someone freely and still be choosing with incomplete information. Harry didn't see deception. He saw strength. He didn't see omission. He saw privacy, and privacy, when respected blindly, can become distance. Distance that only becomes visible when it's too late to bridge easily. According to those close to him now, the real reckoning didn't begin with anger. It began with confusion, a sense that something fundamental had been assumed rather than understood. And that confusion would eventually force Harry to ask a question he had avoided from the very beginning, a question about the past, about timing, about why certain truths seemed to surface only when circumstances demanded them. And once that question was asked, it didn't just challenge his understanding of Meghan, it challenged his understanding of himself. Because the most painful realization wasn't that he might have been kept in the dark. It was that he might have helped keep himself there. But that question didn't emerge in the spotlight. It emerged quietly, privately, in a moment that felt insignificant at the time. A moment Harry would later replay over and over again. Because that was the moment he realized there was more to her story than he had been told, and the consequences of that realization were only just beginning. What if the truth doesn't arrive as a confession, but as a delay? Not a lie spoken aloud, not a secret dramatically revealed, just information that shows up later than it should, after choices have already been made. Because that's how Harry now describes the moment his certainty began to fracture. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't come with shouting or accusations. It came with timing. Have you ever learned something important about someone? Not that it happened, but when you learned it and felt your stomach drop, because timing changes meaning. Harry didn't suddenly discover a shocking detail and react in anger. What unsettled him was realizing that certain truths only surfaced when they were unavoidable, when the future demanded clarity, when decisions couldn't be postponed, when love needed logistics. That's when the silence started to feel intentional. For a long time, Harry framed gaps in the story as boundaries. He told himself that everyone has chapters they don't want to revisit. That trauma doesn't owe anyone full disclosure. And that's true, to a point. But marriage quietly shifts that line, because marriage isn't just about acceptance. It's about alignment. And alignment requires shared information. According to people who have watched Harry wrestle with this privately, the first time he felt something was off wasn't during an argument. It was during a practical conversation, a future-oriented one, the kind that forces you to stop speaking in metaphors. Plans were being discussed, expectations clarified. Theoretical ideas turned into concrete steps, and suddenly, the emotional language that had carried them so far wasn't enough. Harry asked a question, not aggressively, not suspiciously, just earnestly. A normal question, the kind you ask when you assume you already know most of the answer. But the response wasn't what he expected, not because of what was said, because of how long it took to say it, because of the hesitation, because of the reframing, because of the way the conversation shifted from information to emotion. Harry has always been sensitive to emotional shifts. He grew up reading rooms, moods, silences. It's a survival skill when you're raised in an environment where what isn't said matters more than what is. And in that moment, something familiar clicked. This wasn't privacy. It was avoidance. The past, he realized, wasn't just painful. It was curated. Pieces were shared when they served connection, withheld when they complicated it. And again, that doesn't automatically mean malice, but it does mean imbalance. Because one person was making decisions with a full set of assumptions, the other was deciding when the full picture would be revealed. Ask yourself this: is it still honesty if the truth is delivered only after it can't change anything? Harry didn't confront her, not right away. He did what he'd always done. He absorbed it, he rationalized it. He told himself he was overthinking, because questioning the foundation of your marriage is terrifying, especially when you've already burned bridges for it, especially when the world is watching, especially when admitting doubt feels like failure. But doubt doesn't need permission. It settles in quietly, and once it does, it changes how you hear everything else. Harry began replaying old conversations, moments he'd brushed off, stories that felt emotionally true but practically vague. He noticed how often details were generalized, how timelines blurred, how specificity appeared only when necessary, never proactively. And he noticed something else too: the framing. Whenever gaps were pointed out, the response wasn't clarification. It was emotional appeal. Discomfort was reframed as insensitivity. Questions became accusations. Curiosity was treated as pressure. And Harry, deeply conflict avoidant when it comes to emotional confrontation, retreated. Because he didn't want to be the man who interrogated his wife's past. He didn't want to be that guy. But here's the irony. By not asking early, he guaranteed he'd have to ask later, when the stakes were much higher, when answers carried consequences. And consequences are much harder to absorb without resentment. This is where Harry's internal conflict deepened, because on one hand, he believed in respecting boundaries. On the other, he felt increasingly responsible for making decisions without full context. Decisions that affected children, breakup of family ties, public commitments, a life lived in exile. And the question he couldn't escape was simple: why now? Why did certain truths only surface when they could no longer be avoided? Why not earlier, when they might have changed how he understood things? Why not before vows? Why not before sacrifices? Timing isn't neutral. It communicates intent. And according to those who've seen Harry process this, that's what hurt most, not what he learned. When he learned it, because learning late feels like being managed, like being protected from information you had a right to weigh, like being trusted with emotions, but not with reality. And that distinction matters. Harry never claimed perfection in the relationship. He admits he rushed, that he ignored red flags, that he wanted out so badly he didn't pause to inspect the exit door. But what he struggles with now is the idea that the rush may have been encouraged, that the speed may have served someone else's comfort as much as his. That slowing down might have invited questions neither of them wanted to face. Have you ever noticed how some relationships move quickly not because they're strong, but because they can't survive scrutiny? Harry didn't think of it that way at the time. He thought speed meant certainty. He thought intensity meant honesty. He thought emotional transparency meant total transparency. But those are not the same thing. Emotional transparency shows how someone feels. Total transparency shows why. And why is often where the complications live. As time passed, Harry noticed another pattern. Information wasn't volunteered. It was extracted gently, carefully, and often indirectly. And each extraction carried emotional cost, tension, exhaustion, guilt. He began associating questions with conflict and conflict with betrayal. So he stopped asking again. And that silence, once mutual, became asymmetrical because one person already knew the full story. The other was slowly catching up. Harry describes this period now as disorienting, not because he felt deceived outright, but because he felt outpaced, as if the relationship had been running on two different clocks. One clock governed emotion, the other governed information, and those clocks were not synchronized. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, because it suggests something subtle but profound, that you can be deeply loved and still not be fully informed, that someone can care about you and still decide what you're ready to know. That intimacy can exist alongside control, and control doesn't always look cruel. Sometimes it looks protective, sometimes it looks like concern. Sometimes it looks like, I didn't want to hurt you. But intention doesn't erase impact. Harry didn't explode. He didn't confront. He internalized. He asked himself if he was being unfair, if he was overreacting, if his own trauma made him hypervigilant. Because that's what emotionally intelligent people do. They question themselves first. But self-questioning has limits, and eventually it turns into self-doubt. Harry began wondering if his discomfort was the problem, if expecting full disclosure was unreasonable, if love really did require unconditional acceptance of whatever emerged, whenever it emerged. But then reality intervened. Because certain decisions don't allow for ambiguity. They demand clarity. And when clarity was needed, the answers came, slowly, selectively, and emotionally. And that's when Harry felt it. That subtle shift from partnership to imbalance, from shared journey to guided experience, from choosing together to being informed later. And that realization didn't make him angry. It made him sad, because sadness acknowledges loss. Loss of agency, loss of shared decision-making, loss of the relationship he thought he was in. This is where Harry's thinking began to change. Not dramatically, incrementally. He stopped assuming he knew everything. He stopped filling in gaps with optimism. He stopped interpreting silence as sensitivity, and instead, he started seeing it as strategy. Not malicious, but deliberate. And once you see strategy, you can't unsee it. It reframes the past. Moments that once felt romantic now feel rushed. Conversations that once felt deep now feel incomplete. Reassurances that once felt comforting now feel deflective. Harry didn't want to believe this, because believing it meant acknowledging a painful truth, that he might have been in love with the version of someone that was safest to show him, not the full reality. And that realization leads to an even more uncomfortable question. If I had known then what I know now, would I have made the same choices? That question haunted him, because it doesn't accuse anyone. It accuses time, and time doesn't answer back. According to those close to Harry now, this period marked a quiet withdrawal, not emotionally, mentally. He became more observant, more careful, less reactive. He stopped defending automatically. He started listening for what wasn't said. And the more he listened, the more he realized that some truths weren't hidden, they were. Harry started noticing how stories from the past were framed almost exclusively around outcome, not process. Survival, not specifics. Resilience, not details. And again, that framing works beautifully in public narratives. But in a marriage, it can feel incomplete. Because marriages don't just share emotions, they share consequences. The silence became more pronounced as life slowed down. During quieter moments, late nights, long stretches without public engagements, moments where conversation naturally deepens. That's when Harry noticed how often discussions about the future were clear, but discussions about the past stayed abstract. It was as if one direction was fully mapped and the other intentionally blurred. And blur invites imagination. Imagination, in the absence of information, is dangerous because it fills gaps with assumptions. Harry began filling those gaps unconsciously. He assumed the worst had already been shared. He assumed anything missing wasn't relevant. He assumed that if it mattered, he would have known. But assumptions don't age well. They don't survive pressure. And pressure was coming. As Harry moved deeper into adulthood, beyond rebellion, beyond reaction, he began asking himself harder questions. Not about Meghan, about himself. Why did I accept emotional explanations where practical ones were required? Why did I treat silence as sensitivity instead of information? Why did I equate intensity with transparency? Those questions didn't accuse, they illuminated. And illumination changes perspective. Harry began realizing how much he had relied on emotional alignment as proof of honesty. If she felt deeply, she must be open. If she shared pain, she must be transparent. If she cried, she must be telling the whole story. But feelings don't equal facts, and sincerity doesn't automatically include completeness. This is one of the hardest lessons in adult relationships, that someone can be genuine in their emotions and still selective with their truth. Harry noticed something else too. The silence wasn't random. It clustered around moments that preceded major decisions, moments where additional information might have slowed things down, moments where full clarity could have complicated momentum, engagement, relocation, public commitments. Each step forward came with confidence, but not always with context. Harry didn't feel tricked. He felt guided, and guidance, when unrequested, can quietly undermine agency. Have you ever looked back and realized you agreed to something because you didn't know what questions to ask? Not because you were careless, but because you trusted the person walking you through it. Harry trusted. He trusted because he wanted to, because doubt felt disloyal, because questioning felt like reopening wounds, and because love, when under siege from the outside, often tightens inward. The press attacks hardened him. Criticism from family hardened him. And inside that hardening, the relationship became a refuge, not a forum. Refuges are protected, forums are challenged. Harry didn't challenge. He protected, but protection has consequences. It discourages scrutiny. It prioritizes unity over clarity. And clarity doesn't survive long in environments where unity is treated as survival. As time passed, Harry noticed how often silence was paired with emotional reassurance. A gap would appear. A question would surface. And instead of information, reassurance would arrive. I trust you, we're okay, you're overthinking. Reassurance is comforting, but it doesn't resolve uncertainty. It soothes it temporarily. And uncertainty, when unaddressed, doesn't disappear. It waits. Harry began feeling like there were two versions of the past. The emotional one he knew well, and the factual one he hadn't fully seen. And the silence around that second version began to feel heavy, because silence carries meaning, especially when it's consistent, especially when it appears at the same junctions every time. Harry didn't confront, but he observed. He listened, he replayed, and the more he observed, the more he noticed how often conversations about the past ended with deflection, humor, generalization, a pivot to the present. And the pivot worked until it didn't, because the present was now asking questions the past had to answer, and the past remained quiet. This is where Harry's emotional state shifted from confusion to unease. Confusion says, I don't understand. Unease says something doesn't align. Alignment matters deeply to Harry. It always has. He grew up in an institution obsessed with alignment of image, message, and behavior. He knows what misalignment looks like. He's lived inside it, and now he was beginning to feel it at home. Not loudly, suddenly, in tone, in timing, in what was shared and what wasn't. According to those who have seen him process this, Harry began questioning not just the silence, but his reaction to it. Why didn't I push? Why didn't I insist? Why did I accept emotional answers to practical questions? And the answer was uncomfortable, because pushing risked destabilizing the only safe space he believed he had left, because insisting risked conflict, because conflict risked confirming fears he wasn't ready to face. Harry had already sacrificed so much: family, role, public standing. Admitting that something fundamental might be misaligned in his marriage felt unbearable. So he delayed, he waited. He hoped clarity would arrive organically. But clarity doesn't arrive on its own. It has to be invited, and silence rarely invites it. The silence around the past became louder after the children arrived, because children changed the stakes. They turned theoretical futures into immediate realities. They forced conversations about health, expectations, and long-term planning. They removed the luxury of abstraction. Harry noticed how these conversations felt weighted, careful, managed. He began to sense that some truths were being protected, not from harm, but from consequence, and that distinction gnawed at him. Protection implies care, consequence implies responsibility. And responsibility requires shared information. Harry wasn't looking for perfection. He wasn't demanding a full audit of someone else's life. He just wanted to understand the contours of the story he was building his future on. And when that understanding remained partial, the silence became suspect. This is where the emotional tone of the relationship subtly shifted. Not outwardly, inwardly. Harry became less reactive, less performative, less eager to defend without understanding. He started asking softer questions, open-ended ones, questions designed not to accuse, but to invite. And sometimes answers came, but often they circled. They returned to feelings, to resilience, to pain without parameters. And eventually, Harry realized something that unsettled him deeply. The silence wasn't about forgetting, it was about control. Not control in a domineering sense, control in a narrative sense. Deciding which parts of the story existed, which parts stayed emotional, which parts stayed off limits. And once Harry saw that, he couldn't unsee it. Because narrative control is powerful. It shapes perception, it manages expectations, it guides responses. And when only one person holds that control, imbalance follows. Harry didn't accuse Meghan of deception. He accused the situation of asymmetry. One person knew the whole terrain, the other was navigating with partial maps. And partial maps lead to missteps, to wrong turns, to decisions made without full awareness. Harry began to feel like he had been reacting to events instead of participating in decisions. That he was learning things after they mattered. That the silence around the past wasn't just about the past, it was shaping the future. And that realization frightened him, because it suggested that love alone wasn't enough to guarantee partnership. That trust without information could become vulnerability, and vulnerability without reciprocity could become exposure. This is where Harry's internal narrative changed. He stopped asking, "Why didn't she tell me?" and started asking, "Why didn't I know to ask?" That question is devastating, because it places responsibility in both directions. It doesn't absolve, it doesn't accuse, it just exposes complexity. And complexity is harder to live with than blame. According to those close to Harry, this period marked a turning point. Not outwardly, but internally. He stopped assuming the silence would resolve itself. He stopped interpreting reassurance as resolution. He started acknowledging that the silence itself was information. And once you accept silence as information, you're forced to interpret it. And interpretation leads to choice. Harry knew he couldn't continue without addressing the imbalance. But addressing it meant confronting a possibility he had avoided, that the past he thought he understood might not be complete. And that confronting that incompleteness could change everything. Because once silence is broken, intentionally or not, it reveals not just what was hidden, but why. And Harry was about to discover that the reason behind the silence mattered more than the silence itself. Because what came next wouldn't just clarify the past, it would redefine the trust he believed they shared. What if the most unsettling realization isn't that something was kept from you, but that others already knew? Because once Harry accepted that the silence around the past wasn't accidental, a new and far more destabilizing question emerged. Who else was aware of what he wasn't? That question doesn't arrive gently. It lands heavy. It forces you to reevaluate every room you've ever walked into. Harry had always understood that marriage doesn't exist in isolation, especially not his. Advisors, friends, aides, confidants, there was always an orbit. But he had assumed that orbit revolved around transparency. Now, he wasn't so sure. It started subtly, a comment that lingered too long, a look exchanged between people who assumed he already knew something, a hesitation before answering a question that should have been straightforward. Have you ever had that moment where you realize a conversation has already happened? Just not with you? Harry began noticing it more frequently. Not blatant, not malicious, just assumed knowledge. People spoke as if certain things were established, settled, understood. And Harry found himself nodding along, filing away confusion for later. Because, again, confrontation felt risky, but the accumulation was undeniable. He began sensing that there was an unspoken understanding within a small circle, a shared awareness that didn't include him. And that realization is deeply isolating, because it suggests that the version of reality you're operating in may not be the dominant one. Harry's world had always been managed by circles. Royal circles, media circles, security circles. He knew how information traveled. He knew how narratives were curated. What he wasn't prepared for was the idea that similar dynamics might exist inside his own marriage. The inner circle around Meghan was tight, loyal, protective, and Harry admired that at first. He saw it as strength, as solidarity, as resilience against intrusion. But as time passed, he noticed something else. The inner circle didn't just protect, it filtered. Information moved through them selectively, carefully, and often Harry received it last. Not because he wasn't trusted, but because he wasn't considered the decision maker. That distinction hurt more than he expected, because it suggested a hierarchy he didn't realize existed. Harry began reflecting on moments when decisions had already been discussed elsewhere before reaching him. Moments when outcomes were presented as conclusions, not options. Moments when dissent felt like disruption rather than dialogue. And again, he asked himself, is this normal? Or is this imbalance? Inner circles can be healthy. They can also be insular. And insularity breeds assumption. The assumption that everyone is on the same page. The assumption that everyone knows the same things. The assumption that alignment already exists. Harry began realizing that alignment had been assumed, not established. And that assumption rested on the belief that emotional closeness equaled informational equality. It didn't. This realization didn't come with fireworks. It came with discomfort, the kind that settles into your chest and doesn't leave. The kind that makes you replay conversations and notice what you missed. The kind that makes you wonder whether your silence was mistaken for consent. Harry started paying attention to how decisions were framed. Language matters. Everyone agrees. This has already been discussed. We've talked this through. Who is we, and when did that conversation happen? Harry noticed how often he was invited into decisions after momentum had already built, when reversing course would be costly, when questioning would feel obstructive, when hesitation could be framed as lack of support. And support was a currency he had spent freely, because he believed they were aligned. But alignment without information is fragile. It holds until pressure exposes the cracks. The inner circle's role became more visible during moments of crisis, when backlash hit, when plans shifted, when narratives needed reinforcement. Harry watched as responses were coordinated, messages unified, positions solidified. Efficiency, professionalism, control. But he also noticed something else, how little room there was for uncertainty, for questioning, for reevaluation. Once a position was taken, it hardened quickly. And that rigidity mirrored something he'd begun to notice privately, that once certain truths were presented, they were framed as settled, not open to exploration. Harry began to feel like he was stepping into a structure that had been built without him, a structure that expected him to support, not shape. And that expectation conflicted deeply with how he saw marriage. Marriage to him was partnership, shared agency, mutual consent. But what he was experiencing felt more like integration, joining an existing framework, adapting to established dynamics. And that realization forced a painful question. Had he married into a system, not just a person? And if so, what did that mean for his autonomy? Harry didn't resent the inner circle, he resented his own delayed awareness of it. Because once you notice a power structure, you start seeing its influence everywhere. In decisions, in language, in who speaks first, in who reassures whom. Harry noticed how often reassurance flowed toward him, not from him, as if he were the one who needed calming, managing, stabilizing. And that role reversal unsettled him, because he had always seen himself as the protector, the one shielding his partner from harm. But now he began to feel shielded, not from danger, but from information. And that kind of protection feels infantilizing. Have you ever realized someone was trying to protect you by keeping you uninformed? It doesn't feel like care. It feels like exclusion. Harry began recognizing how often difficult information was filtered through others before reaching him, how often decisions were framed in ways that minimized debate, how often concerns were met with emotional reassurance instead of factual clarity, and gradually, painfully, he understood the pattern. The inner circle wasn't hiding things out of malice. They were managing outcomes, managing risk, managing narrative. And Harry, despite being the husband, was considered part of the audience, not the editorial team. That realization hit hard because it reframed everything. Moments he thought were shared decisions now felt like presentations. Moments he thought were mutual agreements now felt like confirmations. And the most painful part? He had participated willingly because he trusted, because he didn't want conflict, because he didn't want to be the obstacle, because he believed love meant support. But support without agency is submission. And that's not what he signed up for. Harry began questioning how often his loyalty had been used to legitimize decisions he hadn't fully influenced. How often his presence had been cited as endorsement. How often his silence had been interpreted as agreement. Those questions didn't accuse Meghan directly, they interrogated the structure around her. And structures don't dissolve easily, especially when they've been effective, especially when they've protected someone for a long time. Harry didn't want to dismantle the inner circle. He wanted to understand his place within it, and that understanding required a conversation he had been avoiding, a conversation about roles, about agency, about who decides, and how. But initiating that conversation meant confronting an uncomfortable truth, that the dynamic may have benefited someone else more than him. And confronting that truth risked destabilizing everything. Because if he wasn't an equal participant, what was he? A symbol? A shield? A legitimizer? Those thoughts haunted him because they clashed violently with the story he had told himself, that this marriage was his escape from institutional control, that he had finally chosen freely, that he was no longer managed. But what if management had simply changed form? What if control had shifted from public to private? That possibility scared him more than royal protocol ever did, because it meant the problem wasn't the institution he left. It was the pattern he hadn't recognized. And once you see a pattern, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. Harry began withdrawing emotionally, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. He became more measured, more observant, less reactive, and that shift didn't go unnoticed. People around him sensed the change. Some interpreted it as maturity, others as distance. But for Harry, it was clarity. He needed to see the dynamic clearly before he could decide what to do about it. Because decisions made in confusion are rarely free, and Harry was done making choices without full awareness. The inner circle remained intact, but Harry no longer assumed alignment. He no longer assumed shared understanding. He no longer assumed he was operating with the same information as everyone else. And that awareness marked a turning point, because once you realize you've been the last to know, you start asking why. And that question doesn't stay contained. It spreads into trust, into communication, into how you interpret every interaction moving forward. Harry knew that addressing this imbalance would require more than observation. It would require confrontation, not aggressive, not accusatory, but direct. And directness had always been difficult for him in intimate relationships, because directness risks rejection. And rejection was a wound he carried deeply, but avoiding it had led him here, to a place where love felt conditional on silence, where loyalty felt one-sided, where partnership felt asymmetrical. Harry wasn't ready to confront everything yet, but he was ready to stop pretending. And the moment that forced his hand didn't come from inside the marriage. It came from outside, from an unexpected comment, a passing remark, something said casually but heard deeply. A remark that made it clear beyond doubt that others had known something long before he did. And that moment shattered any remaining illusion that the imbalance was imagined. Because once you realize you're the only one catching up, you can't go back to believing you were leading. And what Harry heard next would push him past observation into action. What happens when the future demands answers the past never gave? Because the moment that finally pushed Harry out of observation and into reckoning didn't arrive as a fight. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, disguised as planning. The most ordinary conversations are often the most dangerous ones. Children, timing, health, what comes next? Topics couples discuss every day, until they realize they're not starting from the same information. Harry had always imagined family as something simple, almost sacred. Not easy, but honest. You meet someone, you build trust, you talk, you plan, you adapt together. But when these conversations began to move from abstract hopes to real-world logistics, Harry felt something unfamiliar, hesitation, not his, hers. At first, it looked like caution, thoughtfulness, a desire not to rush. And Harry respected that. He had learned, painfully, what rushing could cost. But as the conversations continued, he noticed how quickly they became emotionally charged, even when the questions themselves were practical. How do you imagine the next few years? What would feel right for you? What should we prepare for? Reasonable questions. Yet the answers often drifted into reassurance instead of clarity. Let's not stress. We'll figure it out. We don't need to decide everything now. And again, none of that is inherently wrong, until time starts asking questions of its own. Harry noticed how quickly the conversation would pivot away from specifics. Dates turned into feelings. Plans turned into philosophies. Logistics turned into comfort statements. And the pattern felt familiar. It mirrored the silence around the past. The same emotional language, the same deflection from details, the same sense that certain truths existed, just out of reach. Have you ever felt that moment when the future you're planning depends on information you don't fully have? It creates anxiety, because you're being asked to commit to outcomes without understanding constraints. Harry began to feel that anxiety growing. Not panic, not suspicion, just a quiet sense that he was planning with incomplete data. And when he tried to articulate that feeling, he struggled. Because how do you say, I need more information without sounding accusatory? How do you ask for clarity without implying doubt? Especially when the person you love frames uncertainty as pressure, Harry didn't want to push. He didn't want to reopen old wounds. He didn't want to be the man who reduced deeply personal matters to logistics. But life doesn't care about discomfort. Life moves forward whether you're ready or not. And as life moved forward, Harry noticed how much weight these conversations carried, even when they remained unresolved. There was an unspoken tension, a sense that decisions were being postponed rather than discussed. And postponement, when repeated, becomes avoidance. Harry didn't label it that at first. He told himself it was timing, circumstances, stress. But the unease didn't fade. It sharpened, because expectations were forming anyway, in his mind, in hers, in the space between them. Expectations about family are powerful. They shape identity. They shape sacrifice. They shape what you're willing to endure. Harry had already sacrificed a great deal. Distance from his family, his role, his sense of belonging, and he had done so believing he was building something lasting, something grounded. But now he felt as though the ground beneath that future was less stable than he'd assumed. Not because it was impossible, but because it was undefined. Undefined futures can feel hopeful. They can also feel frightening, especially when you sense that one person may know more about the limitations than the other. Harry began revisiting early conversations, the ones that had felt reassuring at the time. Statements that sounded like openness but lacked detail. Promises that were emotionally sincere but practically vague. He began asking himself a question he hadn't allowed before. Did I confuse reassurance with transparency? That question unsettled him deeply. Because reassurance makes you feel safe, transparency makes you informed, and the two are not interchangeable. As these conversations continued, Harry noticed something else. The emotional stakes felt disproportionate to the questions being asked. Simple clarifications triggered defensiveness. Neutral planning felt loaded. And whenever he pressed gently, not demanding answers, just clarity, the emotional temperature rose. This placed Harry in an impossible position. Push and risk conflict. Back off and accept uncertainty. And he chose again and again to back off, because backing off preserved peace. And peace felt precious after years of chaos. But peace built on avoidance has a shelf life. Harry began to feel like he was being asked to commit emotionally to a future that hadn't been fully explained. And that realization frightened him, because commitment, once given, is difficult to retract. And Harry had already given so much. Have you ever realized you're making promises without fully understanding what you're promising to? That's where Harry found himself, not doubting love, doubting alignment. The conversations around family revealed something deeper. They exposed a difference in how each of them approached disclosure. Harry believed in laying everything out and adapting together. Meghan seemed to believe in managing information to protect emotional stability. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but when combined, they create friction, because one partner feels unprepared, the other feels pressured, and pressure breeds defensiveness. Harry felt himself walking on eggshells, choosing words carefully, avoiding follow-ups, swallowing questions, because every attempt at clarity seemed to carry emotional cost, and over time, that cost accumulated. It became exhausting, not physically, mentally, emotionally. Harry began to feel as though the future was something happening to him rather than with him. And that feeling mirrored something else he had tried to escape his entire life: being managed, being guided, being protected from information. That parallel unsettled him deeply, because he had left an institution to reclaim agency. And now he felt agency slipping again, quietly, politely, and wrapped in concern. Harry didn't accuse. He didn't confront. But he couldn't ignore the contradiction. The relationship was framed as radically honest, yet some of the most consequential topics remained unresolved, or rather, resolved emotionally without being clarified practically. That contradiction gnawed at him, because honesty, to Harry, had always been about facing discomfort head-on. He had done it publicly, painfully. He had aired trauma, admitted mistakes, exposed vulnerabilities. And now he wondered why certain topics within his marriage felt off-limits to that same level of candor. This wasn't about entitlement. It wasn't about control. It was about partnership. And partnership requires shared understanding. Harry began to realize that what troubled him wasn't any single detail. It was the cumulative effect of partial disclosure. The feeling that he was always a step behind, always catching up, always adjusting after the fact. And that feeling intensified around conversations about family, because family amplifies consequences. It's not just about two people. It's about children, about futures that extend beyond personal identity, about decisions that echo. Harry had grown up in a family where expectations were inherited rather than chosen. He didn't want to recreate that dynamic. He wanted conscious choice, informed consent, shared agency. And yet, here he was, sensing that some of the most important parameters were being revealed slowly and selectively. Harry began asking himself another uncomfortable question. Was he being spared information or spared responsibility? Because sometimes withholding details isn't about protection, it's about controlling outcomes. And controlling outcomes shifts power. Harry didn't want power. He wanted parity. And parity requires honesty, not just emotional honesty, but informational honesty. As these realizations settled, Harry noticed a change in himself. He became quieter during planning conversations, more reserved, less enthusiastic. And that change was noticed, but instead of prompting deeper discussion, it often prompted reassurance, comfort, encouragement, which, ironically, deepened the gap, because reassurance without resolution feels dismissive when you're seeking clarity. Harry felt increasingly alone in his concerns, not because he lacked support, but because The support he received didn't address the questions he was actually asking. And that loneliness is dangerous because it isolates you inside your own thoughts. It makes you doubt your instincts. It makes you wonder whether you're being unreasonable. Harry wondered that often. Am I asking too much? Am I being insensitive? Am I projecting my own fears? But each time he tried to dismiss the feeling, it returned. Stronger, because feelings rooted in reality don't disappear through denial. They demand engagement. The breaking point didn't arrive as a dramatic argument. It arrived as a realization that if he didn't address this imbalance now, it would define the rest of his life. That if he continued planning without clarity, he would continue reacting instead of choosing. That love alone couldn't substitute foe.